This incident occurred last summer during a fishing trip. I had taken a trip to a remote lake about 3 hours from where I live. I found this place on a fishing forum. Apparently, it's an insider tip for bass fishing and rarely crowded due to its remoteness. I arrived there on Friday evening and set up my camp at a small clearing near the edge of the lake. There were a few other designated camping spots around the lake, but I chose one that was isolated and offered privacy. The nearest other campsite was at least half a mile away through thick woods, and from what I could see, they were all empty. I had brought enough supplies for 3 days and was looking forward to some solitude and good fishing away from the stress of my job in the city. The first evening went perfectly. The area was incredibly quiet, with only the sounds of lapping water and occasional wildlife. The isolation was exactly what I had been hoping for after months of dealing with all sorts of crap in the office. After falling asleep, I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of a car engine. It was distant but distinct, coming from the direction of the main access road. This struck me as odd since the lake was closed to vehicles after dark, and I hadn't seen any other campers when I arrived. The engine sound was low and rumbling, like a truck or large SUV. I lay in my tent listening as the engine sound grew closer, then stopped somewhere near the lake. After a few minutes of silence, I heard car doors slam, followed by voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but there were definitely multiple people, at least 3 or 4 from what I could tell. They seemed to be moving around near the water, not far from my campsite. I checked my phone and saw it was nearly 3 in the morning. Whatever these people were doing, it wasn't normal camping behavior, and the secrecy of their arrival suggested they didn't want to be noticed. I unzipped my tent quietly and peered out into the darkness. I could see flashlight beams moving around on the opposite shore of the lake, maybe a quarter mile away. Occasionally, I could hear muffled conversation carried across the water. My first thought was that maybe someone had gotten lost or had an emergency. But something about the situation felt wrong. The way they were moving suggested they were being careful, not like people who needed help. They seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they were doing. I decided to stay quiet and observe, rather than announce my presence, especially since I was alone and didn't know who these people were or what their intentions might be. The activity continued for about an hour. The flashlights moved along the shoreline and occasionally into the woods. At one point, I heard what sounded like digging. Then I heard what sounded like heavy objects being moved. Everything went quiet again after what felt like another 30 minutes of work. I waited another 30 minutes before I heard the car doors slam again and the engine start up. The vehicle drove away, heading back toward the main road. I lay awake for the rest of the night, wondering what I had witnessed and whether I should investigate in the morning. When dawn broke, I packed up my fishing gear and decided to walk around the lake to the area where I had seen the lights. It took me about 40 minutes to hike through the woods to the opposite shore, following what appeared to be an old deer trail. I found the spot easily enough because of the disturbed ground and tire tracks leading from the access road to the water's edge. There were clear signs of recent activity. The ground was torn up in several places, and I could see areas where dirt had been moved around. Most unsettling were the holes that had been dug near the water line, several of them about 3 feet deep and hastily filled back in. The soil was still loose and dark, clearly disturbed within the last few hours. Whatever these people had been doing, they had been burying or retrieving something from this location. There were also tire tracks that showed a large vehicle had backed up close to the water, and I could see drag marks in the mud where heavy objects had been pulled to and from the vehicle. The whole scene had an ominous feel to it, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. As I was examining the area more closely, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. There were what appeared to be old holes nearby, some partially grown over with vegetation, suggesting this location had been used for similar activities before. This wasn't a one-time occurrence, but a regular dumping ground for something. I decided to pack up and leave immediately. As I was loading my car, I noticed another vehicle parked at a campsite that had been empty the day before. It was a dark pickup truck with mud-covered license plates. I hadn't heard it arrive, which meant it must have come during the early morning hours while I was investigating the other shore. The truck appeared to be empty, but I couldn't tell if anyone was camping nearby. I didn't want to hang around to find out. The truck's presence made me paranoid that I was being watched. Maybe someone had seen me investigating the disturbed area and was now keeping tabs on me. I loaded my gear as quickly as possible and drove out of the area, constantly checking my rearview mirror to see if anyone was following. The truck remained parked when I left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. On the drive home, I kept thinking about what I should do with what I had witnessed. The whole situation seemed suspicious. When I got back to the city, I decided to call the local sheriff's department and report what I had seen. The deputy I spoke with told me they would send someone to investigate the area. I gave him as much information as I could remember, including the description of the truck I had seen the next morning. A few days later, the deputy called me back. They had investigated the site and found evidence of recent digging, consistent with what I had described. They found several more of these dug-up spots in the area and had opened an ongoing investigation, suspecting that this might be the activity of a crime gang and a potential burial site. Several weeks later, I received another call from law enforcement. They had identified the lake as a dumping ground for stolen goods and possibly worse things. Several arrests had been made in connection with the investigation, though I was never told the full details. The deputy thanked me for reporting what I had seen and said my information had been crucial in uncovering a criminal operation that had been using the remote location for illegal activities. I never found out exactly what those people had been doing at the lake that night, but the whole experience left me shaken. The thought that I had been sleeping just a quarter-mile away from whatever they were doing still gives me chills. I haven't been back to that lake since, and I've become much more careful when choosing isolated camping spots. The experience taught me that even in the most peaceful and remote locations, you might not be as alone as you think. This happened to me about 6 months ago. I was working the overnight security shift at a large office complex downtown. The pay was decent for what was essentially sitting at a desk all night, monitoring security cameras and doing hourly rounds through the building. I'd been doing this job for almost 2 years and had gotten comfortable with the routine. The building was always completely silent after midnight, save for the occasional hum of the HVAC system or the distant sound of late-night traffic outside. Most nights, I'd spend my time reading or browsing my phone between rounds, occasionally glancing at the bank of security monitors that showed empty hallways and dark offices. That particular night started like any other. I arrived at 10 p.m. for the shift change, got briefed by the evening guard about nothing unusual happening, and settled in for what I expected to be another quiet night. The first few hours passed without incident. I did my midnight round, walking through each floor with my flashlight, checking doors and making sure everything was secure. All the offices were locked, the stairwells were empty, and the emergency exits were properly secured. The building felt exactly as it should have, completely vacant and peaceful. Around 2 in the morning, I was back at the security desk when one of the monitors caught my attention. The camera covering the 15th floor hallway showed what looked like a figure moving past the frame. It was just a brief shadow, barely visible, but enough to make me look twice. I rewound the footage and watched it again, but the image was too grainy and quick to make out any details. It could have been a trick of the light or a reflection from outside, but something about it nagged at me. Still, protocol required me to investigate any unusual activity, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the elevator. The 15th floor housed a law firm that took up the entire level. During my previous rounds, it had always been completely dark and empty. As the elevator doors opened with their familiar ding, I immediately noticed something different. There was a faint light coming from somewhere down the hall, barely visible, but definitely there. I walked slowly down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the silence despite my efforts to move quietly. The light seemed to be coming from one of the corner offices. As I got closer, I could see it was just the glow of a computer monitor. Someone had left their workstation on, which wasn't entirely unusual. I approached the office and peered through the glass door. The computer was on, displaying what looked like a document or spreadsheet with text I couldn't read from the doorway. The office itself appeared empty. I tried the door handle, expecting it to be locked like all the others, but it turned easily. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, planning to shut down the computer and continue my rounds. My heart rate picked up as I looked around the office more carefully. There were papers scattered across the desk that hadn't been there during my midnight round. Documents that looked like they had been recently pulled from files and left open. Someone had been here recently. I grabbed my radio to call for backup, but as I reached for it, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Moving away from my location, I moved to the doorway and looked out, but the hallway appeared empty. The footsteps had stopped, but I could swear I heard the faint sound of a door closing somewhere down the corridor. I stood there for several minutes, listening, but heard nothing more. My hands were shaking slightly as I decided to continue checking the other offices on the floor, moving more cautiously now. As I worked my way down the hall, I found 2 more offices with computers still running and signs of recent activity. In one, there was an open file cabinet with folders pulled out and papers on the floor. In another, the desk drawers were partially open, as if someone had been searching through them hastily. The unsettling realization hit me that someone else was in the building, someone who shouldn't be there. They were moving around, staying just ahead of me, turning on computers and going through files. But every time I got close to their location, they seemed to vanish. The building suddenly felt enormous and full of hiding places I had never considered before. I spent the next hour methodically searching the entire 15th floor, but found no one. I checked every office, every conference room, every storage closet. It was as if someone was playing an elaborate game of cat and mouse with me, always staying one step ahead. I checked the stairwells, the bathrooms, even the supply closets, but the floor seemed completely empty. Frustrated and increasingly nervous, I returned to the security desk to review the camera footage. What I saw made my blood run cold and my stomach drop. The cameras clearly showed a figure moving through the hallways, but not just on the 15th floor. They were on multiple floors, moving systematically through the building like they were conducting their own rounds. The person seemed to know exactly where the cameras were positioned, staying mostly in blind spots and moving quickly past the areas under surveillance. But there were enough glimpses to see that whoever it was knew the building layout intimately. More disturbing was the timeline. The footage showed this person had been in the building for hours, moving around while I was completely unaware. They had been there during my midnight rounds, somehow avoiding detection while I walked the very hallways they were occupying. In some clips, they appeared to be following me at a distance, staying just out of sight as I conducted my security checks. I watched one particularly chilling sequence where the figure entered an office just minutes after I had checked it, turned on the computer, and began going through files. They worked quickly and efficiently, clearly looking for something specific. When they heard me returning, they quickly shut everything down and disappeared into what must have been a supply closet. I immediately called the police and my supervisor. While waiting for them to arrive, I remained at the security desk, watching the monitors intensely and reviewing more footage. I didn't see any more movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every reflection in the dark windows made me jump, and every small sound from the building's systems made my heart race. When the police arrived, they conducted a thorough search of the entire building but found no signs of forced entry and no one hiding inside. The security footage was the only evidence that someone had been there. They took a copy of the recordings and filed a report, but without any theft or vandalism. They didn't have much to go on. They suggested it might be corporate espionage, someone trying to steal confidential information from the law firm. My supervisor reviewed the footage and was as baffled as everyone else. The building's keycard access system showed no unauthorized entries, and all the doors and windows were properly secured. Whoever had been in the building either had legitimate access or was extremely skilled at bypassing security systems. The fact that they knew the building layout so well suggested they had been inside before. Over the following days, I learned that several documents were indeed missing from the law firm's offices, though it took them a while to determine exactly what had been taken. The firm hired a private security company to investigate, but they never found any evidence of who was responsible. I finished out that shift and the rest of the week, but I never felt comfortable in that building again. 2 weeks later, I put in my notice and found a different job. I never found out who was in the building that night or how they got in. The whole experience left me deeply unsettled and disturbed. This happened about 3 years ago when I was living in an apartment just outside of town. I lived on the 10th floor and had been staying there for about 8 months when all this occurred. The building had decent security, with keycard access required for both the main entrance and the elevators. There was a doorman during the day, but at night there was only a security camera and the electronic access system. One evening, I had been out late with friends and didn't get home until around midnight. Admittedly, slightly tipsy, I used my keycard to enter the building and took the elevator up to my floor. As I walked down the hallway toward my apartment, I noticed that one of the apartments near the end of the hall was standing slightly open. This struck me as odd since most people were pretty security conscious in the building and always shut their doors immediately. I slowed down as I approached the open door, wondering if I should check if everything was okay. The apartment belonged to a woman I had seen occasionally, but I had never interacted with her. The hallway was dimly lit, and I couldn't see much through the partially open door. As I got closer, I could hear faint sounds coming from inside the apartment. It sounded like someone moving around, but there were no lights on that I could see. I stopped outside the door and listened more carefully. The sounds were subtle, but definitely indicated someone or something was inside, moving around quietly. I was torn between checking if everything was okay and not wanting to intrude. After a moment of hesitation, I knocked lightly on the door frame and called out softly, asking if everything was all right. The sounds inside immediately stopped. I waited several seconds, but there was no response and no further noise from the apartment. I knocked again and identified myself as a neighbor from down the hall, but nothing came back. The silence from the apartment was now complete, and somehow more unsettling than the sounds had been. I tried to peer through the crack in the door but couldn't see anything in the darkness. At this point, I was genuinely concerned that something might be wrong. I knew the building management had emergency contact information for situations like this. I went to my apartment and called the after-hours maintenance number, explaining the situation to the person who answered. The person said he would come up to check on the apartment and asked me to wait in the hallway until he arrived. While I waited, I kept watching the partially open door, but saw no further signs of activity. The building was dead silent. The maintenance guy arrived about 20 minutes later. We approached the apartment together. The door was still ajar, exactly as I had left it. He called out loudly, identifying himself as building maintenance and asking if anyone needed assistance. When there was no response, he pushed open the door and switched on the lights. The apartment showed clear signs of a struggle. Furniture was overturned, personal items were scattered across the floor, and there were obvious indications that someone had searched through the belongings hastily. But there was no sign that anybody was there. After looking around for a while, the maintenance guy decided it was best to call the police. When the officers arrived, they conducted a search of the apartment and took our statements, and I told them everything I had witnessed before signing off and heading off to my apartment. The next day I was contacted by the police, and they informed me that they had located the tenant's car in the building's parking garage. They hadn't found any signs of forced entry either. They had also reviewed the building's security cameras, which showed the lady entering the building sometime in the evening, but never saw her leaving. The police interviewed other residents on the floor, but no one else had heard or seen anything unusual. The elevator cameras showed several people coming and going during the evening, but none that couldn't be accounted for as legitimate residents or visitors. Over the next few days, the investigation expanded. The tenant's workplace and family were contacted, but no one had heard from her since that evening. Her apartment was processed as a potential crime scene, and missing person reports were filed with multiple agencies. What I couldn't explain was what I heard that night when I came home. When I first heard the sounds from the apartment, someone had been inside, moving around in the darkness. I had gone back to my apartment for only a few minutes to phone up the maintenance guy, which probably had been the opportunity for whoever was in the apartment to make an escape. But whether it was the tenant herself or someone else, I had been just feet away from whatever was happening. If I had entered the apartment instead of going to get help, I might have walked into a dangerous situation. The case was never solved, despite a lengthy investigation. Police never determined what happened to the tenant or who had been in her apartment that night. She was never found, and no arrests were made. The apartment remained empty for months before eventually being re-rented to someone new. I can only assume that something bad happened to her, but I don't know if I really want to know the details. At some stage, the police also stopped informing me on the progress, so they might have come across new findings that I don't know anything about. I moved out of the building about a year later, thanks to a new job opportunity. I couldn't say I was sad that I had to leave, as that night had left a deep mark in me. I am since living in a new apartment complex and have never come across another situation like this again.